Sometimes the heart knows what it needs before the mind can understand. We all carry wounds that make us wonder if we're worthy of love, if someone could see past our brokenness to the person we truly are inside. Lord Thorne had lived for 300 years in his dark castle, alone, and convinced that a monster like him could never find true companionship. When a letter arrived from a woman willing to marry him sight unseen, he dared to hope again. She wrote of kindness and acceptance, of not being afraid of his darkness, but when his mail-order bride arrived by horse-drawn cart, he discovered she had no legs and used a wooden wheelchair she had crafted herself. Her name was Elsbeth, and she was nothing like he expected. What happens when two broken souls meet and discover that love isn't about perfect bodies, but perfect hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The castle of Ravenshollow, perched on the jagged cliffs like a great stone predator, its towers piercing the perpetual mist that shrouded the valley below. For 3 centuries, it had been home to Lord Thorne Blackwood, though home was perhaps too gentle a word for what had become his beautiful prison. The ancient stones held memories in their very mortar, memories of laughter that had long since faded, of warmth that had been replaced by the eternal chill of solitude. Thorne moved through the corridors with the fluid grace of a creature no longer bound by mortal limitations. His footsteps echoed against the vaulted ceilings, a lonely percussion that had become the soundtrack to his existence. The portraits lining the great hall watched him pass, with painted eyes that seemed to hold judgment for what he had become. Lords and ladies of his mortal family, long dead and buried while he remained unchanged, frozen in time like an insect trapped in amber. The transformation had come during the siege of Acre, in the year of our Lord 1191. He had been Sir Thorne then, a knight of some renown, fighting alongside King Richard's crusaders against Saladin's forces. The vampire who had turned him a creature ancient even then had whispered promises of power, of the strength to save his men, to return to his beloved Rosalind with victories that would secure their future. Instead, by the time he had returned to England, Rosalind lay dead of plague, and his family had aged beyond recognition while he remained as young as the day he had sailed for the Holy Land. The irony was not lost on him that he had gained immortality only to lose everything that made life worth living. His daily existence had settled into routines as rigid as monastery bells. He woke each evening as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber, and rose though he could not see those colours, for the heavy curtains remained drawn against even the weakest rays. Gareth would have prepared his evening meal, though calling it a meal was generous. The goblet of blood, procured from the village animals through carefully maintained arrangements with the local butcher, sustained his supernatural body, while providing none of the pleasure that food had once brought to his mortal palate. After feeding, he would walk the castle grounds, checking the ancient walls that kept the world out and him within. The gardens had long since grown wild, though Gareth did his best to maintain small sections near the kitchen. Thorne had forbidden him from hiring additional help. The fewer people who knew the true nature of the castle's master, the better for everyone involved. The evening hours were spent in his vast library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge. Books in 12 languages lined shelves that reached toward ceilings lost in shadow. Here, among the chronicles of history and philosophy, the poetry of long-dead bards, and the treatises of forgotten scholars, Thorne sought what he could never find: peace. The written word had become his companion, his confessor, his link to the world of humanity he had lost. But it was his war journal that revealed the true measure of his isolation. Bound in leather that had aged to the color of dried blood, its pages chronicled not just battles fought and enemies vanquished, but the gradual erosion of his soul. Early entries spoke of duty and honor, of love for Rosalind, and dreams of a future together. As the years passed, the entries grew darker, more introspective, marking his growing distance from human emotion until the final pages, written decades ago, spoke only of duty to maintain his self-imposed exile. Gareth had been with him for 40 years now, arriving as a young man seeking employment and remaining as one of the few souls brave enough or foolish enough to serve a vampire lord. He had aged from youth to middle years, to the silver-haired figure who now moved through the castle with the careful steps of advancing arthritis, while Thorne remained unchanged. It was Gareth who had finally broken the silence that had settled over the castle like dust. "My lord," he had said one evening as he brought the evening goblet, his voice carrying the gentle authority of long service. "Perhaps it is time to consider that isolation, while safe, is not the same as living." The suggestion had been planted like a seed in ground Thorne had thought barren. For months he had wrestled with the idea of seeking companionship. Not love, he was too damaged for such fairy tales, but perhaps someone who might understand solitude, who might accept what he was, without requiring him to pretend to be what he once had been. The enchanted scroll had arrived on a night when the mist hung particularly thick around the castle towers. Gareth had found it at the gates, glowing with a faint luminescence that spoke of magic older than Thorne's curse. The parchment was thick and fine, the handwriting careful and elegant, though the hand that had formed the letters clearly struggled with each word. "To the Lord of Ravensollow," it began, "I write to you from the province of Millhaven, where rumours speak of a nobleman who keeps to himself and asks little of the world. I am Elsbeth Fairfax, daughter of Aldrich the Healer, and I seek a marriage of convenience and mutual respect. I offer skills in healing arts, knowledge of herb lore, and a temperament that has learned not to fear darkness, for I have walked in it myself. I ask no questions about your nature if you ask none about mine. I seek only a home where I might be useful and perhaps in time find some measure of peace. If this proposal finds favor in your sight, send word, and I shall come with such belongings as I possess and such hope as I dare carry." The letter had been signed with a shaking hand, but the signature was clear and proud. At the bottom, as if added as an afterthought, were the words, "I should mention that I am not as other women, having been much changed by fire. I hope this will not prove an impediment to our arrangement." Thorne had read the letter a dozen times that first night, searching between the lines for hints of deception or ulterior motive. He found instead a kind of resigned dignity that resonated with his own condition. Here was someone else who had been marked by tragedy, who understood the weight of being different, who sought not passion but peace. His response had been carefully crafted, revealing nothing of his vampire nature, while expressing cautious interest in her proposal. He had mentioned his preference for evening hours, his somewhat isolated nature, and his willingness to provide a home for someone who understood the value of quiet companionship. The exchange of letters had continued for several weeks, each missive revealing a careful intelligence and a practical nature that he found unexpectedly appealing. She wrote of her father's healing practice and her own skill with medicinal herbs. She mentioned her love of reading and her practical approach to household management. What she did not mention, and what he did not press her to reveal, was the nature of the changes that fire had wrought upon her. He had assumed, perhaps, some scarring that might make her marriage prospects limited. The thought had stirred his sympathy, for he understood too well what it meant to be marked as different. The wedding arrangements had been negotiated through letters with a practical efficiency that both found comfortable. No great ceremony, no family celebrations, a simple exchange of vows with Father Benedict from the village, witnessed by Gareth and whatever servants Elsbeth might bring. She would come with her belongings and her commitment to make their arrangement work. He would provide a home, protection, and whatever comfort his resources could offer. As the day of her arrival approached, Thorne had found himself experiencing emotions he had thought long dead. Not the passionate love of his youth, but something quieter and perhaps more precious hope. The castle had been cleaned and aired, new furnishings added to the chambers that would be hers. Gareth had prepared the finest meal his skills could manage, and Thorne had dressed in his best clothes, black velvet that had been tailored in a century past, but remained elegant in its simplicity. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would greet her with courtesy and respect. He had prepared for many possibilities, shyness, nervousness, perhaps some initial fear at the castle's imposing atmosphere. What he had not prepared for was what actually arrived. The sound of cartwheels on cobblestones had drawn him to the great windows of the main hall. Through the gathering dusk, he could see a modest wooden cart, pulled by a patient mare, driven by an elderly man who might have been a farmer or tradesman. A figure sat beside the driver, wrapped in a dark cloak against the evening chill, sitting with the stillness of one accustomed to long journeys. Thorne had made his way to the courtyard, Gareth at his side, both of them watching as the cart drew to a halt before the castle steps. The driver had climbed down first, moving to the side of the cart where the cloaked figure waited. It was then that Thorne saw it, the wooden wheelchair, carved from oak and fitted with iron wheels, that the driver carefully lifted from the cart's bed. The figure in the cloak had moved with practiced efficiency, transferring herself from the cart seat to the wheelchair with a grace that spoke of long experience. When she finally pushed back her hood and looked up at the castle steps where Thorne waited, he saw a face of quiet beauty framed by auburn hair, eyes the colour of forest moss, meeting his with steady composure. "Lord Thorne," she had said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I am Elsbeth Fairfax. I have come, as promised, to be your wife." And in that moment, as evening shadows lengthened around them and the ancient stones of Raven's Hollow seemed to lean inward to witness this unexpected scene, Thorne realized that all his careful preparations, all his assumptions about what this arrangement would be, had crumbled like parchment in flame. For here was a woman who carried herself with such dignity, such quiet strength, that he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about beauty, about wholeness, about what it truly meant to be complete. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Thorne stood frozen on the castle steps, his prepared words of welcome dissolving on his tongue as he stared at the woman who had just declared herself his wife. Elsbeth remained seated in her wooden wheelchair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to others needing time to adjust to her presence. The wheelchair itself was a marvel of craftsmanship that spoke to both necessity and pride. Carved from solid oak, its arms were smooth from use, and the iron-rimmed wheels showed the careful attention of someone who understood that mobility was not a luxury, but a lifeline. Small pouches hung from the sides, filled with what appeared to be herbs and healing supplies, and the back was fitted with cushions that had been sewn with obvious care. This was not a device of shame, but a tool created by someone who refused to let circumstance define her limitations. "My lord?" Elsbeth's voice carried a note of gentle inquiry, and Thorne realized he had been staring far longer than courtesy allowed. The elderly driver who had brought her her father's servant, she had mentioned in one of her letters, was watching the exchange with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had seen this reaction before. "Forgive me," Thorne managed, descending the steps with measured control. He stopped, uncertain how to finish the sentence without giving offense. "I was not expecting this. Seemed cruel. I was surprised would be obvious. I was unprepared, felt too much like an accusation. You were not told." Elsbeth finished for him, her tone matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "I had hoped my letter was clear enough, but perhaps I was too subtle in my wording. The fire that changed me took my legs, Lord Thorne. I have not been able to walk since I was 15. Her directness cut through his confusion like a blade through silk. Here was no coy maiden hiding behind euphemisms, but a woman who had learned to speak truth with the efficiency of someone who could not afford to waste time on delicate feelings. The realization both impressed and unsettled him. Gareth stepped forward with the instinctive courtesy of good breeding. "My lady, welcome to Ravenshallow. I am Gareth, Lord Thorne's steward. If you would permit me, I would be honoured to assist with your belongings." Elsbeth's face brightened, with what Thorne would later recognize as relief at meeting kindness without pity. "Thank you, Master Gareth. I have little enough, a chest of clothes, my healing supplies, and a few books that I could not bear to leave behind." As Gareth and the driver began unloading her modest possessions, Thorne found himself studying Elsbeth more closely. She wore a travelling dress of deep green wool, practical rather than fashionable, but well-made and clean. Her auburn hair was caught back in a simple braid, though wisps had escaped during the journey to frame a face that was indeed beautiful, though not in the delicate way of court ladies. Her features spoke of character rather than perfection, intelligent eyes, a mouth that suggested both humour and determination, and skin that bore the faint marks of someone who had spent time outdoors, despite her limitations. "You must be tired from your journey," Thorne said, finally remembering his role as host. "Please, allow me to show you to your chambers." "We can." He paused, suddenly aware of the castle steps that led to the main entrance, steps that would be impossible for her wheelchair to navigate. Elsbeth followed his gaze and smiled with what might have been amusement. "I see you are beginning to understand some of the practical considerations of my condition, my lord. Fear not, I am accustomed to finding alternate routes." She manoeuvred her wheelchair with practiced ease around the side of the castle, where Thorne suddenly remembered the old service entrance that led directly into the kitchen courtyard. He had not used it in decades, but Gareth had kept it maintained. As they made their way along the cobblestone path, Thorne found himself watching how smoothly she navigated the uneven stones, compensating for bumps and dips with small adjustments that spoke of long experience. "Your chair," he said hesitantly. "You made it yourself." "My father taught me woodworking when it became clear that the chairs available for purchase were built by men who had never needed to use one themselves," she replied, running one hand along the worn armrest. "This has served me well for nearly 10 years now." They reached the kitchen entrance, where Gareth had already preceded them to open doors and light additional candles. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, its large hearth casting dancing shadows on stone walls lined with copper pots and dried herbs. A wooden table dominated the center of the room, scarred by years of use but scrubbed clean. "I had thought you might prefer the main dining hall," Thorne began, but Elsbeth shook her head. "This is perfect," she said, settling her wheelchair beside the table with evident satisfaction. "I have always found kitchens to be the true heart of any home. There is honest work here, and the smell of herbs reminds me of my father's workshop." Gareth bustled about, setting out cold meat, fresh bread, and a wheel of cheese that represented his best effort at formal dining. A bottle of wine accompanied the simple fare, along with earthenware cups that had seen better days but were clean and serviceable. For Thorne, he discreetly placed a goblet that contained his own evening sustenance, though the nature of its contents was carefully concealed. As they ate, or in Thorne's case, pretended to eat, while sipping carefully from his goblet, conversation came in fits and starts. Elsbeth asked practical questions about the castle, its layout, and the surrounding village. Her interest seemed genuine rather than polite, and Thorne found himself describing aspects of his domain that he had not spoken of in years. "The village of Millbrook lies 3 miles down the mountain path," he explained. "The people there are good folk, though they keep largely to themselves. They know to leave offerings at the crossroads, shrine grain, livestock that has died naturally. In return, I ensure their protection from bandits and wolves, and they are not afraid of Nust." "You?" Elsbeth asked, cutting her bread with neat, economical movements. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications. Thorne met her eyes across the table, seeing curiosity rather than fear, intelligence rather than revulsion. "They know stories," he said carefully. "Old tales of the lord who keeps to his castle, who is never seen in daylight, who has lived longer than any man naturally should. But I have never harmed any of them, and their grandparents were protected by my presence, as are they." "Stories of a vampire lord," Elsbeth said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather. Thorne went very still. In 3 centuries, no one had spoken that word to him directly, without fear or hatred or the trembling whisper of superstition. To hear it said so matter-of-factly, across a kitchen table while sharing bread and cheese, was more shocking than any accusation. "You are not surprised," he said, and it was not a question. "A man who prefers evening hours, who never visits the village in daylight, who has lived in the same castle longer than anyone can remember, and who drinks only from a covered goblet while his guests eat food." Elsbeth smiled, and there was gentle humor in her expression. "My father was a healer, my lord. He taught me to observe carefully and draw logical conclusions. I suspected what you were before I ever agreed to marry you. And yet you came, and yet I came." She reached across the table to touch his hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin. "I told you in my letters that I was not afraid of darkness. I meant those words." The touch of her hand sent an unfamiliar sensation through Thorne's immortal frame, not desire, exactly, though that was part of it, but something deeper and more fundamental. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that here, finally, was someone who looked at him and saw not a monster or a curse, but simply a man who had been changed by circumstances beyond his control. As the evening wore on, with Gareth quietly clearing away the remains of their meal and banking the fire for the night, Thorne found himself sharing details of his existence that he had never spoken aloud. His need for blood, carefully obtained and never taken by force, his sensitivity to sunlight, though holy symbols and running water posed no threat, his enhanced strength and senses, which he used primarily to protect his domain rather than to hunt. In return, Elsbeth spoke of her life since the fire, the long, painful recovery, the discovery that her legs could not be saved, the gradual rebuilding of her life around new limitations and unexpected strengths, her work assisting her father with patients who trusted her skill, if not always her appearance, the growing certainty that she would never marry in the conventional sense, and her eventual decision to seek an unconventional arrangement. "I have learned," she said as Gareth escorted her to the chambers that had been prepared, "that wholeness is not about having all your pieces intact, it is about making the most of what remains." As Thorne watched her wheel herself down the corridor, guided by Gareth's careful attention to her needs, he felt something shift within his chest, something that had been frozen for centuries, beginning, perhaps, to thaw. For the first time in longer than he cared to remember, the castle did not feel like a tomb. It felt, tentatively and impossibly, like it might become a home. The morning after Elsbeth's arrival brought the first true test of their arrangement. Thorne woke as the sun reached its zenith, his body instinctively responding to the rhythm that had governed his existence for 3 centuries. He dressed with unusual care, choosing a shirt of deep blue that Gareth had once insisted brought out his eyes, though Thorne had long ceased to care about such vanities. He found Elsbeth in the kitchen garden, a small courtyard enclosed by stone walls where Gareth had managed to coax herbs and vegetables from the mountain soil. She sat in her wheelchair beside a raised bed of rosemary and thyme, her healing pouch open on her lap as she examined the plants with the critical eye of someone who understood their properties intimately. "Good morning, my lord," she said without turning around, having heard his approach despite his naturally silent movement. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," Thorne replied, though sleep had been elusive as his mind wrestled with the implications of his changed circumstances. "I trust Your chambers were comfortable? Very much so. Master Gareth took great care to ensure everything was arranged to my needs. She held up a sprig of mint that had seen better days. Though I fear your herb garden has been somewhat neglected. The plants are healthy enough, but they would benefit from more systematic harvesting and care. There was no criticism in her tone, merely the practical assessment of someone who understood growing things. Thorne found himself oddly defensive nonetheless. Gareth does his best, but his knowledge of such matters is limited. Of course, Elsbeth agreed readily. Men of his generation were rarely taught herb lore. It was considered women's work, though I have never understood why healing should be relegated to any single sex. She maneuvered her wheelchair closer to another bed, where lavender grew in wild profusion. My father always said that plants respond better to those who understand their nature. They are like people, in that way they thrive when properly tended. The comparison hung in the air between them, and Thorne wondered if she was speaking only of plants. He watched as she reached carefully into the lavender, selecting specific stems with the precision of long practice. Her movements were economical and sure, wasting no motion as she gathered what she needed. "You have skill in this," he observed, settling himself on a stone bench where he peopled 2%, could watch her work without looming over her. "My father began teaching me when I was quite young," she replied, placing the gathered herbs carefully in her pouch. "After the fire, when it became clear that I would need a trade to support myself, he intensified the lessons. A healer who cannot walk must compensate with superior knowledge." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of her limitations continued to astound him. Where he had spent centuries brooding over his transformation, she seemed to have accepted hers and moved forward with practical determination. "The fire," he said carefully, "if you do not mind speaking of it." "I do not mind," she interrupted gently. "I was 15, helping my father treat a fever epidemic that had struck the village. We were working by candlelight in the cottage of a family too poor to afford oil lamps. The youngest child, delirious with fever, knocked over a candle while I was tending her. The cottage was old, the timbers dry from a particularly harsh summer." She paused in her gathering to look directly at him. "My father and the family escaped quickly. I was trapped when a burning beam fell across my legs. By the time they could move it," she shrugged with the resignation of someone who had long since made peace with unchangeable facts. "The burns were severe. Infection set in. My father, skilled though he was, could not save what was already destroyed." "I am sorry," Thorne said, meaning it more deeply than the conventional words could convey. "Thank you." She returned to her work, but her voice remained reflective. "I spent many months angry at God, at fate, at the cruel chance that had placed me in that cottage at that moment. But anger, I learned, is a luxury I could not afford. There was still work to be done, still people who needed healing. I could either waste my life mourning what I had lost, or discover what I might still accomplish." The parallel to his own experience was not lost on Thorne. He too had raged against his transformation, had spent decades cursing the vampire who had stolen his mortality and the fate that had cost him everything he loved. Yet, where Elsbeth had chosen to rebuild, he had chosen to withdraw. "You shame me," he said quietly. Elsbeth looked up from her herbs with surprise. "My lord, your courage, your acceptance. I have spent centuries hiding from the world, convinced that my curse made me unfit for human company. Yet here you are, having faced your own tragedy with a dignity I have never managed. We each respond to adversity in our own way," she said thoughtfully. "Perhaps isolation was what you needed then. Perhaps you simply were not ready to rejoin the world until now." The suggestion that his long solitude might have served a purpose rather than simply being a failure of character was oddly comforting. As they sat together in the herb garden, surrounded by the green scents of growing things and the gentle warmth of filtered sunlight, Thorne, felt something ease within him that had been tightly wound for longer than he could remember. Their conversation was interrupted by Gareth's approach, his arms full of linens and his expression bearing the slightly harried look of someone trying to manage an unfamiliar household. "My lord, my lady," he said with a slight bow, "I beg your pardon, but I find myself at a loss regarding the arrangement of Lady Elsbeth's chambers. The furniture is too high." Elsbeth finished with an understanding smile. "Do not distress yourself, Master Gareth. I am accustomed to making adjustments. If you could help me move the chest to where I can reach it easily, and perhaps lower the wash basin." "I could have new furniture made," Thorne interjected, then stopped, suddenly uncertain. "That is, if you plan to, if this arrangement is to be more than temporary." The awkwardness of his words hung between them like morning mist. They had agreed to marriage, yes, but the practical implications of sharing a life together had not been fully explored. Was this to be a marriage in name only, a convenience for them both, or something deeper? Elsbeth reached across the space between her wheelchair and his bench to touch his hand again, as she had the night before. "I came here with the intention of making this my home, Lord Thorne. If you will have me." The simple words carried a weight of commitment that made Thorne's throat tighten unexpectedly. When had anyone last chosen to stay with him, to build something together rather than simply endure his presence? "I would be honored," he managed, and meant it completely. The rest of the morning was spent in the practical business of making Elsbeth comfortable in her new home. Gareth, once given direction, proved remarkably adaptable, moving furniture and adjusting arrangements with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing a household for an unconventional master. Elsbeth supervised with gentle authority, never demanding, but making her needs clear. As Thorne watched her take charge of organizing her new domain, he felt something stirring within him that he had not experienced in centuries, the desire to please someone, to make them happy, not from duty, but from genuine affection. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, opening chambers of his heart that he had thought sealed forever. 3 days into their arrangement, Elsbeth discovered the portrait entirely by accident. She had been exploring the castle's upper reaches, determined to understand the full scope of her new home, when one of her wheelchair's wheels caught on a loose floorboard in what appeared to be a disused sitting room. As she maneuvered to free herself, her movement caused a dust cloth to slip from a painting that had been carefully concealed for decades. The woman in the portrait was breathtakingly beautiful in the classical sense, golden hair that caught light like spun silk, eyes the color of summer sky, skin pale and perfect as fresh cream. She wore a gown of deep rose velvet that spoke of wealth and position, and her smile held the confident sweetness of someone who had never known real hardship. The nameplate at the bottom of the ornate frame read simply, "Rosalind, beloved." Elsbeth sat studying the painting for a long time, understanding immediately who this woman must be and why the portrait had been hidden away. The love that had inspired this commission was evident in every brushstroke, in the careful attention to detail that spoke of countless hours spent memorizing beloved features. This was the face of Thorne's mortal past, the woman he had lost to plague while he gained his cursed immortality. She was still there when Thorne found her an hour later, having come looking when she failed to appear for their evening meal. He stopped in the doorway when he saw what she had uncovered. His face going carefully blank in the way she was learning meant he was experiencing strong emotion. "I apologize," he said stiffly. "I should have removed that long ago. The room is not used, I had not thought." "She was lovely," Elsbeth said quietly, not moving from where she sat before the portrait. "You loved her very much." Thorne entered the room slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "Rosalind Ashworth. We were to be married upon my return from the Holy Land." His voice carried the careful control of someone speaking of old pain. "She died of plague the winter before I came home. She was 22. "The same age I was when I came to you," Elsbeth observed without bitterness. "Yes." Thorne moved to stand beside her chair, both of them looking up at the portrait. "Though you bear no resemblance to her beyond that." The statement hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address directly. Elsbeth could see the differences clearly enough. Where Rosalind had been delicate and ethereal, she herself was practical and earthbound. Where the painted woman radiated the protected innocence of nobility, Elsbeth carried the quiet strength of someone who had earned her wisdom through suffering. "Do you wish I did?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Thorne was quiet for so long that she began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "When I first conceived of seeking a wife, I think perhaps I imagined finding someone who might fill the empty spaces that Rosalind's death had left." He reached out to touch the frame of the portrait, his fingers tracing the carved wood as if it were a relic. "I thought I wanted someone who would help me forget. And now? Now I find myself grateful that you are nothing like her." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did Elsbeth. Rosalind was kind and gentle, but she lived in a world of beauty and comfort. She would have been horrified by what I became, terrified of the darkness I now inhabit. You, he turned to look at her directly, you understand shadows. You know what it means to be changed by circumstances beyond your control. Elsbeth felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. Not the desperate relief of someone settling for whatever affection they could find, but the genuine pleasure of being valued for who she actually was, rather than how closely she might approximate someone else's memory. "I was afraid," she confessed, "that I would always be competing with a ghost." "No," Thorne said with surprising firmness. "Rosalind belongs to my past, to the man I was before. You, if you are willing, belong to whatever future I might still have." The conversation might have continued, might have led to admissions that neither was quite ready to make, but it was interrupted by the sound of Gareth's voice calling from the corridor below. "My lord, Lady Elsbeth, we have visitors." They found Gareth in the main hall, looking flustered as he faced the small group of villagers who had apparently made the trek up the mountain path. At their head stood a woman Elsbeth recognized. From her father's descriptions, Marta Hensley, the baker's wife, holding a child of perhaps 6 years who was clearly fevered and distressed. "Please," Marta said, addressing her words to Thorne but glancing hopefully at Elsbeth. "My youngest has taken sick with a fever that will not break. Old Meg, the herb woman, died this past winter, and we have no one else to turn to. We heard, that is, word has come that Lord Thorne's new wife has healing knowledge." Elsbeth did not wait for formal permission. She wheeled her chair forward, extending her hands toward the child. "May I examine him?" The examination took place in the kitchen, with Marta and 2 other village women hovering anxiously while Elsbeth checked the boy's temperature, looked at his throat, and asked careful questions about his symptoms. Thorne watched from the doorway, fascinated by the transformation that came over her as she worked. Gone was the careful courtesy of their private interactions, replaced by the confident authority of someone who knew her profession intimately. "It is not the plague," she announced, and the relief in the room was palpable. "But it is a serious fever that requires immediate attention. Master Gareth, do you have honey in the kitchen? And I will need hot water for brewing tea." What followed was a demonstration of skill that left even Thorne impressed. Elsbeth moved between her healing supplies and the kitchen facilities with practiced efficiency, brewing teas, mixing poultices, and giving detailed instructions for the child's care. She spoke to the worried mother with exactly the right combination of reassurance and seriousness, neither minimizing the illness nor allowing panic to take hold. By the time the villagers departed 2 hours later, the child's fever had already begun to respond to treatment, and his mother carried detailed, written instructions for continued care. More importantly, word had clearly spread throughout the group that the vampire lord's new wife was not only skilled, but genuinely caring. "They will return," Thorne observed as they watched the small procession make its way down the mountain path. "I hope so," Elsbeth replied, and the satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. "I had not realized how much I missed having patience to tend." As they made their way back into the castle, Thorne found himself seeing his domain through new eyes. For centuries, it had been a fortress designed to keep the world at bay. Now, suddenly, it felt as if it might become something else, entirely a place where the world might come seeking help rather than avoiding contact. The change was both exhilarating and terrifying, opening possibilities he had not dared to consider since his transformation. For the first time in 3 centuries, Ravenshollow felt less like a tomb and more like a home that might actually harbour life. Within a fortnight of treating the Hensley boy, Elsbeth had become something of a legend in the valley below. Word spread with the efficiency that only good news could achieve in small communities. The vampire lord's wife was not only a skilled healer, but welcomed those who sought her aid with genuine kindness. The trickle of visitors that had begun with Martha Hensley soon became a steady stream of people, carrying their ailments and injuries up the mountain path to Ravenshallow's gates. Thorne found himself experiencing an emotion he had not felt in centuries: jealousy, not the passionate jealousy of romantic rivalry, but something more complex and unsettling, the possessive instinct of someone who had lived in isolation, discovering that the one bright presence in his darkness was eagerly sought by others. He watched from shadowed doorways as farmers and craftsmen, mothers and children, all competed for Elsbeth's attention with their various needs, and felt something twist unpleasantly in his chest. She seemed to glow in their presence, her face lighting with purpose and satisfaction as she examined wounds, diagnosed ailments, and dispensed remedies with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. The contrast to their quiet evening conversations was stark during the day. She was vibrant and animated, fully engaged with the world. In the evenings, when it was just the two of them sharing meals in the kitchen or sitting in the library, she was gentler, more contemplative, as if she were a different person entirely. "You are troubled, my lord," Gareth observed one evening as they watched Elsbeth bid farewell to the day's last visitor, a young mother whose infant had been suffering from colic. "If I may say so, may I not be pleased that my wife has found purpose in her new home?" Thorne replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Gareth, who had spent 4 decades learning to read his master's moods, was not fooled. "Indeed, my lord, though perhaps your pleasure would be greater if that purpose included more attention to her husband." The observation struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Thorne had grown accustomed to having Elsbeth's complete focus during their conversations, to being the sole recipient of her thoughtful questions and gentle insights. Sharing her with an apparently endless parade of villagers felt like a loss he had not anticipated and was not prepared to handle gracefully. His brooding was interrupted by a commotion in the courtyard, raised voices, and the sound of rapid movement that suggested urgency rather than the usual calm of Elsbeth's healing practice. Through the window, he could see her wheelchair positioned beside the castle steps, where she was examining someone who appeared to have been injured. By the time Thorne reached the courtyard, the situation had become clear. A young man named Willem, whom Thorne recognized as the blacksmith's apprentice, lay on the thyme, ground with his leg bent at an unnatural angle. His face was grey with pain and shock, and Elsbeth was speaking to him in the soothing tones she used with all her patience, while her hands moved expertly along the injured limb. "The bone is broken," she announced to the small crowd that had gathered. "Cleanly, which is fortunate, but it must be set properly, or he will never walk without a limp." She looked up at Thorne, who had approached close enough to hear her diagnosis. "I need to get him inside where I can work properly, but the steps—" Without hesitation, Thorne stepped forward and lifted the young man as easily as if he were a child, his vampire strength making light work of what would have been a difficult burden for a mortal man. Willem's eyes widened as he felt the supernatural power in those arms, but pain and shock, left him little capacity for fear. "Bring him to the kitchen," Elsbeth directed, wheeling herself alongside Thorne as he carried the injured apprentice. "Gareth, I will need hot water, clean linen, and the strongest spirits we have in the house." What followed was an education in both healing arts and leadership. Elsbeth transformed the kitchen into a surgery with swift efficiency, directing Gareth and the gathered villagers with quiet authority, while preparing Willem for what she warned would be an extremely painful procedure. Thorne found himself assigned the crucial task of holding the young man steady while she worked to set the broken bone. "This will hurt," she told Willem honestly, "but the alternative is permanent lameness. Are you prepared?" The boy, who could not have been more than 18, nodded with the desperate courage of someone who understood he had no choice. "Do what you must, my lady." The procedure was brutal to witness, even for someone who had seen centuries of warfare and violence. Willem's screams echoed off the kitchen walls, despite the leather strap Gareth had provided for him to bite, and more than one of the watching villagers had to step outside for air. But Elsbeth worked with steady hands and unwavering concentration, her face a mask of professional composure that revealed nothing of whatever emotions she might be experiencing. Through it all, Thorne held the thrashing young man immobile with strength that could not be resisted, feeling every tremor of agony that passed through Willem's body. It was intimate work, requiring absolute trust and coordination between them, and by the time the bone was properly set and splintered, both he and Elsbeth were exhausted. "He will recover fully," she announced to the worried crowd, wiping blood from her hands, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone accustomed to such work. "But he must remain still for several weeks, while the bone knits. His master will need to find temporary help." The gratitude that followed was overwhelming. Willem's father, the village blacksmith, wept openly as he thanked them both. The other villagers looked at Thorne with new eyes, not just as the mysterious lord who protected them from a distance, but as someone who would use his supernatural strength to help rather than harm. As the crowd dispersed and Willem was carefully transported to his family's cottage with detailed instructions for his care, Thorne and Elsbeth found themselves alone in the kitchen once more. The silence between them was different, now charged with an awareness that had not been there before. "You were magnificent," Thorne said quietly, meaning it completely. Elsbeth looked up at him from her wheelchair, her face still showing the strain of the difficult procedure. "We both were. I could not have managed without your strength." The simple acknowledgement of their partnership sent warmth through Thorne's chest. For the first time since her arrival, he understood that her work with the villagers was not taking her away from him. It was something they could share, a purpose they could pursue together. "The ancient wedding rings," he said suddenly, the words emerging before he could fully consider them. "They belong to my family, passed down through generations before my transformation. I have been thinking if you would consider—" Elsbeth reached across the space between them to touch his hand, her fingers still stained with Willem's blood, but warm and gentle against his skin. "I would be honored to wear your family's rings, my lord, when you are ready to offer them." The promise hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. And for the first time since his transformation, Thorne allowed himself to believe that his future might hold something other than solitude. The blood chalice had been crafted in Constantinople during the reign of Justinian, its silver bowl etched with symbols that predated Christianity and its stem wrought in the shape of intertwining serpents. For 3 centuries, it had been Thorne's most closely guarded secret, hidden away in a chamber, beneath the castle that no living soul had ever seen. It was both necessity and shame made manifest, the vessel that sustained his cursed existence while serving as a constant reminder of what he had become. Elsbeth discovered it entirely by accident on a night when sleep eluded her and she had taken to exploring the castle's lower reaches. A wrong turn in the maze of storage chambers had led her to a narrow stair she had not noticed before, and curiosity had drawn her down into the depths where Thorne believed no one would ever venture. The chamber she found was sparse and cold, containing only a simple altar, the ornate chalice, and the unmistakable scent of blood. She was still there, sitting quietly in her wheelchair before the altar, when Thorne came looking for her an hour before dawn. He stopped in the doorway as if turned to stone, his face cycling through shock, horror, and finally resignation as he realized that his last secret had been laid bare. "You should not be here," he said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been despair. "No," Elsbeth agreed, not moving from where she sat. "I should not. But I am here nonetheless, and I have seen what I have seen." She gestured toward the chalice with one steady hand. "This is how you feed." It was not a question, and Thorne did not treat it as one. Yes, the single word carried the weight of centuries of shame. "The blood, is it human?" Her voice remained calm, though he could hear the tension beneath the surface composure. "No." He stepped into the chamber, moving slowly as if approaching a wild creature that might flee at any sudden movement. "Never human. I have fed only on animal blood since my transformation, livestock that died naturally, game that I hunt myself in the deep forest. I have never taken a human life to sustain my own." The relief that crossed her features was visible, though she tried to hide it. "I'm glad to know that. But it does not change what I am," Thorne continued, his voice growing harsh with self-recrimination. "I am a creature that survives by consuming blood, that exists in defiance of natural law, that saves young men's lives with supernatural strength." Elsbeth interrupted firmly. "That protects an entire valley from bandits and predators. That has shown me more kindness and consideration than any mortal man ever did." She maneuvered her wheelchair closer to where he stood. "You are not what you eat, Thorne. You are what you choose to do with the life you have been given." The use of his given name without title or formality sent an unexpected shock through him. In 3 centuries, no one had spoken his name with such gentle familiarity, such acceptance of the man beneath the monster. "You are not afraid," he observed, studying her face for signs of the revulsion he was certain must be there. "Should I be? You have had countless opportunities to harm me if that was your intent. You drink your blood from a chalice in a private chamber, not from the throats of innocents. You choose sustenance that requires no victims." She reached out to touch the altar's edge, her fingers tracing the ancient stone. "My father taught me that the measure of a person is not in their afflictions, but in how they choose to bear them." The practical acceptance in her voice was perhaps more shocking than fear would have been. Thorne had spent centuries expecting horror, revulsion, and rejection from anyone who learned the truth of his nature. To find instead this calm assessment of facts, this willingness to see his choices rather than just his condition, left him emotionally off balance in a way that no amount of time had prepared him for. "There is more," he said, compelled by her honesty to offer complete truth. "The need comes upon me regularly. Every few days I must feed, or the hunger becomes difficult to control. And there are aspects of my nature that are not as benevolent as you might hope." "Tell me," she said simply. So he did. He spoke of the enhanced senses that allowed him to hear heartbeats from rooms away, to smell fear and arousal, and the 100 subtle scents that marked human emotion. He described the strength that could crush stone or break necks with casual ease, the speed that could cover miles in minutes, the way his body had become a weapon that required constant conscious control to prevent casual destruction. He told her of the hunger that was not just for blood, but for the life force that flowed within it, the vampiric instinct that whispered of easier ways to feed, of the sweet satisfaction that could be found in willing victims who would offer their throats in exchange for the dark pleasure his bite could provide. "But I have never acted on those impulses," he finished, his voice rough with the effort of such complete honesty. "I chose exile instead. I chose isolation rather than risk becoming the monster that my nature invites me to be." Elsbeth was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking, her eyes moving between his face and the blood chalice that sat like an accusation between them. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully measured. "You speak of your nature as if it were a separate entity, something that acts upon you, rather than something that is part of you. But from what I have observed, your nature includes both the vampiric hunger and the will to resist it, the capacity for violence and the choice to use your strength for protection instead. You are not fighting your nature, Thorne. You are expressing the best parts of it." The observation struck him like a physical blow, reframing 3 centuries of self-understanding in a handful of sentences. He had always seen his restraint as a constant battle against his true self, his isolation as necessary protection for the world. To have her suggest instead that his choices were themselves expressions of his nature, that the vampire and the man were not separate entities warring for control but aspects of a single complex whole, it was both liberating and terrifying. "I do not deserve your acceptance," he said quietly. "Perhaps not," she agreed with a small smile, "but you have it nonetheless. The question now is what we choose to do with it." As dawn approached, and Thorne felt the familiar weight of daylight pulling at his consciousness, he realized that everything had changed between them yet again. The last barrier between them had not just been crossed, but demolished entirely, leaving them standing together in territory that neither had expected to explore. For the first time in centuries, the blood chalice felt less like a symbol of his shame and more like simply another tool for survival, no different from Elsbeth's wheelchair or his own careful management of sunlight exposure. It was part of their reality, but it need not define their future. The cursed scroll lay hidden beneath a loose stone in the library's furthest alcove, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved its ancient parchment for longer than most kingdoms had existed. Elsbeth discovered it 3 weeks after their conversation in the blood chamber, while researching healing texts that might help her understand Thorne's supernatural physiology. Her wheelchair had bumped against the stone with unusual force, dislodging it enough to reveal the wrapped bundle beneath. The parchment was covered in script so archaic that she had to puzzle out each word with painstaking care, cross-referencing it against the oldest texts in Thorne's collection. What she found made her blood run cold, with a mixture of hope and terror that left her hands shaking as she read. The Curse of Eternal Night. The scroll was titled, written in the flowing script of a medieval monk, being a true and faithful account of the breaking thereof, as witnessed by Brother Aldwin of Glastonbury Abbey in the year of our Lord 1156. The document detailed the transformation of Sir Marcus de Beaumont, a knight who had been turned during the Second Crusade under circumstances remarkably similar to Thorne's own. Like Thorne, Marcus had sought the power to protect those he loved, only to return home to find them lost to plague and time. Like Thorne, he had withdrawn from the world in horror at what he had become. But Marcus's story had not ended in eternal solitude. The scroll described how he had eventually found love with a woman named Eleanor, a healer who had seen past his monstrous nature to the man beneath. And it was Eleanor who had discovered the truth that made Elsbeth's heart race with desperate hope that the vampire curse could be broken. The requirements were specific and terrible in their simplicity. The vampire must be truly loved by someone who knew the full extent of his nature, someone who chose to love him not in spite of his darkness, but because of the totality of who he was. And that person must be willing to offer their life freely, not in despair or madness, but as a conscious choice made from perfect love. The scroll was explicit about the mechanism. Let the beloved take silver, blessed by holy water, into their heart, while speaking the words of release, and if their love be true and their sacrifice willing, the curse shall be broken and the vampire return to mortal state. But know that the price is absolute, life for life, mortality for mortality. The beloved shall pass from this world as the cursed returns to it. Elsbeth read the passage 3 times before its full meaning penetrated her understanding. She could save Thorne, could give him back his mortality, his freedom from the endless hunger, his ability to exist in daylight among normal people. All it would cost was her life. The decision should have been difficult. She had found purpose at Ravenshollow, had built a life worth living despite her limitations. The villagers depended on her skills. Gareth had become like family. And Thorne had become something she had never expected to find. Not passion in the romantic sense that young girls dreamed of, but something deeper and more precious, true partnership, understanding, acceptance. But the more she contemplated the scroll's revelation, the more certain she became that this was why she had been brought to this place, to this man. Her entire life, the fire that had taken her legs, the years of learning healing arts, even the practical approach to love that had led her to answer his marriage proposal, all of it had been preparation for this moment, this choice. She spent 3 days researching the ritual in Thorne's extensive library, confirming details and seeking any possible alternative. The texts were consistent and unforgiving. There was no other way to break a vampire curse, no compromise that might allow them both to survive. It was her life for his mortality, freely given or nothing at all. The hardest part was not the decision itself, but hiding it from Thorne. His supernatural senses made deception difficult. He could hear the acceleration of her heartbeat when she thought about the scroll, could smell the changes in her scent that marked emotional turmoil. She deflected his concerned questions with half-truths about adapting to castle life and managing the increasing demands of her healing practice. It was Gareth who finally noticed that something was seriously amiss. He found her one evening in the kitchen, grinding herbs with mechanical precision, while tears ran silently down her cheeks. "My lady," he said gently, setting down the tea service he had been carrying, "you are in distress. How may I help?" The kindness in his voice, the grandfatherly concern he had shown her since her arrival, broke through her carefully maintained composure. Without fully intending to, she found herself telling him everything about the scroll, the curse, the terrible choice that lay before her. Gareth listened without interruption until she finished, then sat heavily in the chair across from her. "You mean to do it," he said, and it was not a question. "How can I not?" she replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I love him, Gareth. Not the way young girls love handsome princes, but the way someone loves a soul that complements their own. He has been trapped in darkness for 3 centuries. How could I have the power to free him and choose not to use it? And have you considered," Gareth asked carefully, "what your death might do to him? He has loved and lost before, my lady. To lose again, especially knowing that your death was the price of his freedom, do you truly think that would be a gift?" The question struck her like a physical blow, introducing a doubt she had not allowed herself to consider. In her focus on the mechanics of breaking the curse, she had not fully contemplated the emotional aftermath. Would Thorne's freedom be worth anything if it came at the cost of another beloved's life? Would he thank her for the sacrifice, or would it destroy him more completely than the curse ever had? "I do not know," she whispered, the admission torn from her throat, "but I know that he deserves the choice. He deserves to know that freedom is possible, even if the price is higher than either of you should have to pay," Gareth finished grimly. He reached across the table to cover her hand with his weathered one. "Promise me you will not act without speaking to him first. Promise me you will give him the opportunity to refuse this sacrifice." The promise was harder to make than the original decision had been. Part of her wanted to simply perform the ritual without warning, to spare Thorne the agony of choosing between her life and his freedom. But Gareth was right. Thorne deserved to know, deserved the chance to make his own choice about what price he was willing to pay. "I promise," she said finally. "I will tell him. Soon. But even as..." She spoke the words. She was calculating how long she could delay the conversation, how much time she could give them together before the burden of knowledge changed everything between them. Because once she told him about the curse scroll, once the possibility of breaking his vampiric nature became real, their relationship would never be the same. For now, she wanted to preserve what they had built together. The quiet evenings, sharing books and conversation, the satisfaction of working together to help the villagers, the growing sense that they were building something meaningful together. Once the shadow of the curse breaking fell across their future, all of that would be colored by the knowledge of what it might cost. As she made her way to her chambers that night, wheeling through corridors that had become familiar and comfortable, Elsbeth tried to memorize every detail of the life they had created together. The way candlelight flickered off the ancient stone walls, the sound of Thorne's voice reading aloud from whatever book had caught his interest, the gentle rhythm of their shared domesticity. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the day after, she would have to tell him what she had discovered. She would have to watch the joy of possible freedom war with the horror of its price in his immortal eyes. She would have to offer him a choice that no one should ever have to make, and live with whatever he decided. But tonight, she could still pretend that their greatest challenges were managing her healing practice and navigating the gradual deepening of their unconventional partnership. Tonight, she could still hope that love might be enough, without requiring the ultimate sacrifice. The scroll lay hidden in her chambers, waiting to change everything. But for one more night, Elsbeth allowed herself to live in the world where its revelation had not yet shattered the careful peace they had built together. The silver dagger arrived at Raven's Hollow 3 days after Elsbeth's conversation with Gareth, delivered by a hooded stranger who left it at the castle gates without explanation. Wrapped in midnight blue velvet, the blade was ancient and beautiful, its silver surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in candlelight. Along the fuller of the blade ran an inscription in Latin, Veritas liberat, truth liberates. Elsbeth recognized it immediately from the descriptions in the curse scroll. This was the ritual blade required for the breaking ceremony, appearing as if summoned by her discovery of the ancient text. The weight of destiny pressed down upon her shoulders as she held it, understanding that forces larger than her own will were at work, drawing all the pieces of this supernatural puzzle into alignment. She was still examining the dagger when Thorne found her in the library, and the shock on his face told her that he knew exactly what she held. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was experiencing powerful emotion. "It was delivered to the gates," she replied, setting the blade carefully on the reading table between them. "But I suspect you know what it is." Thorne approached the table slowly, his eyes never leaving the silver weapon. "It is the dagger of truth. I have not seen it for nearly 2 centuries, though I knew it still existed somewhere in the world." He looked up at her with growing suspicion. "How did you know to expect it?" The moment of revelation had arrived sooner than she had anticipated, but Elsbeth found herself oddly relieved that the burden of secrecy could finally be lifted. From beneath her shawl, she withdrew the cursed scroll, unrolling it carefully on the table beside the dagger. "I found this 3 weeks ago," she said quietly, "hidden in the library's foundation stones. It describes the breaking of a vampire curse," Thorne finished, his voice hollow with shock. He had gone very still, his supernatural stillness more pronounced than usual, as if the news had frozen him entirely. "You know how it works?" "Yes." The single word carried the weight of everything she had not been able to say for 3 weeks. "I know the price. I know what must be sacrificed." Thorne's reaction was immediate and violent. He swept the dagger from the table, with enough force to embed it in the stone wall 6 inches deep, his face contorting with rage and anguish. "No," he said, and the words seemed torn from the depths of his soul. "No, I will not have it. I will not trade your life for my freedom." "It is not your choice to make," Elsbeth said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The scroll is clear, the sacrifice must be willing, freely given. Only I can decide whether to pay this price, and I am deciding not to allow it. Thorne's voice rose to something approaching a roar, and for the first time since her arrival, Elsbeth saw the predator that lurked beneath his careful control. His eyes had taken on an inhuman gleam, and she could see the fangs that normally remained hidden. "You think I could live with your blood on my hands? You think I could enjoy mortality purchased with your death?" "I think," Elsbeth said calmly, though her heart was racing at the display of supernatural fury, "that you have suffered enough. That 3 centuries of exile and self-hatred is payment enough for whatever sin you believe you committed in accepting the vampire's offer." "You do not understand what you are saying," Thorne said, beginning to pace with the restless energy of a caged predator. "I am a monster, Elsbeth. Perhaps I choose not to kill, but the hunger is always there, the temptation always present. You would die to free something that deserves to remain chained." "You speak of yourself as if you were a rabid animal," Elsbeth replied, with a flash of irritation that surprised them both. "But I have lived with you, Thorne. I have seen you at your most vulnerable moments, when you thought no one was watching. You are not a monster, you are a man who has been cursed with monstrous abilities and has chosen to use them for protection rather than predation." Their argument was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard, followed by Gareth's voice calling for Lord Thorne with obvious urgency. Through the library windows, they could see a group of riders approaching, men in the brown robes of the church, led by a figure Elsbeth recognized with growing dread as Father Benedict, the priest who had been meant to officiate at their wedding ceremony. "They have come to annul our marriage," she said with sudden certainty. "Someone has convinced the church that our arrangement is unnatural, unholy." Thorne's expression shifted from anguish to cold fury. "Let them try. No earthly authority will take you from me." They made their way to the great hall to meet their unexpected guests, Thorne walking beside Elsbeth's wheelchair with the protective stance of someone prepared for battle. Father Benedict stood in the center of the hall, flanked by 4 other clerics, his usually kind face set in lines of stern disapproval. "Lord Thorne," the priest began without preamble, "I have come at the direction of Bishop Aldrich to investigate the circumstances of your recent marriage and to determine whether the union can be permitted to stand." "On what grounds do you question it?" Thorne asked, his voice carrying dangerous undertones that made the younger priests shift nervously. "On the grounds that you are not human," Father Benedict replied bluntly. "Reports have reached the bishop of unnatural strength, of a lord who never appears in daylight, of strange happenings at this castle that suggest congress with dark powers." Elsbeth felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized the implications. If their marriage was annulled by church authority, she would be forced to leave Ravenshollow. And if she was taken away now, with the ritual, components finally assembled but unused, the opportunity to break Thorne's curse might never come again. Furthermore, Father Benedict continued, his gaze shifting to Elsbeth, "There are questions about the lady's own fitness for holy matrimony, a woman who practices arts that some consider witchcraft, who treats ailments in ways that suggest supernatural knowledge." "Stop." Thorne's voice carried a note of command that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the castle. "Lady Elsbeth is a skilled healer who has done nothing but good in this valley. If you wish to question my nature, do so. But you will not malign my wife." The protective fury in his voice sent warmth through Elsbeth's chest, even as she recognized the impossibility of their situation. The church officials had not come to be reasoned with, they had come to separate them, and they had the authority to do it. "The marriage will be annulled," Father Benedict announced with the finality of official decree. "Lady Elsbeth will return with us to be examined by proper church authorities to determine whether her healing practices constitute witchcraft. If she is found innocent, arrangements will be made for her placement in a suitable convent." "No," Elsbeth said clearly, her voice carrying across the great hall with surprising strength. "I will not go." The pronouncement seemed to surprise the clerics as much as it did Thorne. Father Benedict frowned at her with paternal disapproval. "You do not have a choice in this matter, my child. The Church's authority in matters of marriage is irrelevant," Elsbeth interrupted. "If the marriage in question is not simply a human institution, but a supernatural bond that transcends earthly law." She maneuvered her wheelchair closer to where the silver dagger still protruded from the wall, her hand moving to grasp its hilt. The metal felt cold against her palm, but also strangely right, as if it had been waiting for her touch. "I invoke the right of trial by ordeal," she declared, using knowledge gleaned from her father's books about ancient church law. "If our marriage is blessed by divine will, let God himself demonstrate it. If it is unholy, let me perish in the attempt to prove otherwise." The ancient words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before both heaven and earth. Father Benedict's face went pale as he recognized the invocation, a procedure so old and dangerous that it had not been used in living memory. "You do not know what you ask," he whispered. "Trial by ordeal with supernatural forces involved. The consequences could be what God wills," Elsbeth finished firmly. "I am prepared to accept whatever judgment comes." As she spoke, she caught Thorne's eye across the hall, seeing understanding dawn in his immortal gaze. She was not simply challenging the Church's authority, she was creating the conditions necessary for the ritual that could break his curse. If the trial by ordeal proceeded, if the circumstances aligned as she hoped, she might be able to perform the sacrifice before anyone could stop her. The question was whether Thorne would understand her intent and allow it to happen, or whether he would intervene to save her life at the cost of his freedom. As the clerics huddled in urgent consultation and evening shadows began to lengthen across the great hall, Elsbeth felt the weight of destiny pressing down upon them all, drawing them toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of their marriage, but the very nature of the souls involved. The silver dagger seemed to pulse with anticipation in her grip, and she knew that whatever came next would change everything forever. The ancient ritual chamber beneath Ravenshollow had not seen use for centuries, but it seemed to awaken as the participants descended the narrow stone steps. Torches blazed to life without being lit, casting dancing shadows on walls carved with symbols that predated both Christianity and the vampire curse that had brought them to this moment. At the center of the chamber stood a circular altar of black stone, its surface worn smooth by ages of ceremony and sacrifice. Father Benedict moved with obvious reluctance, his clerical training warring with his instinctive fear of the supernatural forces gathering around them. Behind him, the other church officials clustered together like sheep sensing wolves, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight. They had agreed to witness the trial by ordeal only because church law demanded it, but none of them had expected to find themselves in a place where the very air seemed to hum with otherworldly power. Elsbeth positioned her wheelchair beside the altar with calm determination, the silver dagger resting across her lap like a promise and a threat. She had changed into a simple white dress that Gareth had found in the castle's stores, a garment that had once belonged to some long-dead lady of the house, now serving as ritual garb for a ceremony none of them fully understood. "You do not have to do this," Thorne said for the dozenth time since they had descended into the chamber. He stood close enough to touch her but did not, his hands clenched at his sides with the effort of restraint. "There must be another way." "There is no other way," Elsbeth replied gently, her fingers tracing the Latin inscription on the dagger's blade. "And you know it as well as I do. This is why the scroll was hidden where I would find it. This is why the dagger came when it was needed. We are not here by accident, Thorne." Around her neck, almost hidden beneath the white fabric of her dress, hung a pendant that had belonged to her mother, a simple moonstone set in silver that had been her only inheritance from a woman who had died, bringing her into the world. As the supernatural energies in the chamber built toward crescendo, the stone began to emit a faint, pearlescent glow that made several of the priests gasp in alarm. "The pendant," Father Benedict breathed, his eyes widening with recognition. "It bears the mark of the old bloodlines, the families who carried healing magic before the church drove such practices underground. You are not simply a skilled herbalist, you carry the blood of the ancient healers." Elsbeth looked down at the glowing pendant with surprise. Her father had never mentioned anything about magical bloodlines or supernatural heritage. As far as she had known, her healing abilities came from study and practice, not from inherited power. "I do not understand," she said, touching the warm stone with wondering fingers. "My father never spoke of such things." "Perhaps he did not know," Thorne said thoughtfully, moving closer to examine the pendant. "Or perhaps he knew but chose not to burden you with that knowledge. The old magic has been dormant for generations. It would take something significant to awaken it." As if summoned by his words, the besses to spake exapit, Moonstone's glow intensified, casting silver light throughout the chamber that seemed to resonate with the carved symbols on the walls. The effect was beautiful and terrifying, transforming the underground space into something between a cathedral and a tomb. "The ritual must begin," Father Benedict announced, though his voice shook with obvious fear. "The trial by ordeal, once invoked, cannot be abandoned without severe spiritual consequences for all involved." Elsbeth nodded, lifting the silver dagger with steady hands, despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. According to the curse scroll, the words of release had to be spoken with perfect intention, the sacrifice offered with complete willingness. Any hesitation, any doubt, would cause the ritual to fail and likely result in her death without freeing Thorne from his curse. "Wait," one of the younger priests called out, pointing at the pendant with trembling fingers. "Look at the stone, it's changing." The moonstone had begun to pulse with increasing brightness, and within its depths something was stirring. Images flickered across its surface, like reflections in disturbed water scenes of ancient rituals, of healers working by moonlight, of magic being passed from mother to daughter through generations of women who had guarded secrets older than recorded history. "The bloodline awakens," Father Benedict whispered, and there was awe in his voice now rather than fear. "She is not just offering her life for love, she is channeling power that has been sleeping in her family for centuries. This is not simply a breaking curse ritual, this is a restoration of balance between light and darkness, mortal and immortal, natural and supernatural." As understanding dawned, Thorne stepped back from the altar with something approaching horror. "Elsbeth, stop. If you are carrying ancient magic, if this ritual will do more than simply trade your life for my mortality—" "It changes nothing," she said firmly, though the pendant's growing radiance was making her feel strange, as if power were flowing through her veins alongside her blood. "Whatever magic I carry, whatever power awakens, it does not change the fact that you have suffered long enough. You deserve freedom, Thorne. You deserve the chance to live again as a mortal man." The moonstone reached a crescendo of brilliance that forced everyone in the chamber to shield their eyes. In that moment of blinding light, Elsbeth began to speak the words of release, her voice carrying with it harmonics that seemed to come from the stone itself, from the magic awakening in her blood, from the very foundations of the castle above them. The words of release flowed from Elsbeth's lips in a language she did not recognize but somehow understood, each syllable resonating through the chamber with the weight of ancient authority. The moonstone pendant blazed like a captured star, and from somewhere in the depths of the castle's foundation, something answered her call. A phoenix feather materialized above the altar, its golden plumes shimmering with their own inner fire as it drifted down to rest beside the silver dagger. According to the curse scroll, this was the final component, the symbol of rebirth and transformation that would complete the ritual. As it touched the black stone, the entire chamber filled with warmth and light that seemed to come from the feather itself. Incredibile, Father Benedict breathed, falling to his knees as he witnessed power that transcended his understanding of theology. The divine hand moves here. This is not witchcraft or dark sorcery, this is something far older and more sacred. The other priests followed his example, kneeling in recognition of forces beyond their comprehension. Even their fear had been replaced by awe as they watched ancient magic work its will in the depths of Raven's Hollow. Thorne stood transfixed, his supernatural senses overwhelmed by the convergence of energies swirling around the altar. He could feel his curse responding to Elsbeth's words, the bonds that had held him for 3 centuries beginning to loosen and shift. But instead of the simple breaking he had expected, something far more complex was occurring. "The magic recognizes what you are," Elsbeth said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the pendant itself. "Not a monster to be cured, but a guardian who has earned redemption through centuries of protection and restraint. The curse will not simply be broken, it will be transformed." As she raised the silver dagger, preparing to complete the sacrifice that would seal the ritual, the phoenix feather burst into flame. But instead of consuming itself, the fire spread outward in patterns of golden light that wrapped around both her and Thorne, binding them together in visible threads of supernatural energy. "No," Thorne said, finally understanding what was happening. "Elsbeth, stop. The magic, it's not taking just your life. It's creating something new, something that will change us both." But Elsbeth had already pressed the blessed silver blade to her heart, speaking the final words that would complete the transformation. "For love freely given, for darkness willingly embraced, for the balance between mortal and immortal, let what was cursed be blessed, let what was broken be made whole." The silver blade pierced her heart, but instead of the death she had expected, Elsbeth felt a rush of power unlike anything she had ever experienced. The moonstone pendant's magic flowed into her wound, mixing with her blood and the supernatural energies of the ritual to create something entirely unprecedented. Thorne cried out as he felt his vampire nature shift and change, but not disappear. The endless hunger that had driven him for centuries transformed into something else, a connection to the natural world, to the ancient magics that Elsbeth's bloodline carried. He was no longer a creature sustained by blood alone, but something new, a guardian bound to protect and nurture rather than simply to survive. The phoenix feather completed its burning and rose as pure light, settling into both of them like a blessing. Where it touched Thorne, his supernatural abilities remained, but were purified of their monstrous aspects. Where it touched Elsbeth, her magical heritage fully awakened, healing her heart wound while leaving her changed in ways that would take time to understand. "Impossible," one of the younger priests whispered. "She should be dead." The blade pierced her heart. "The old magic protects its own," Father Benedict said with dawning understanding. "She carries the blood of healers who served as intermediaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. The ritual did not require her death, it required her transformation." As the light faded and the supernatural energies settled into new patterns, Elsbeth found herself still seated in her wheelchair but feeling fundamentally different. The pendant against her chest was warm but no longer blazing, and she could sense new abilities stirring within her, not just healing knowledge, but actual magical power that could mend what was broken and restore what was lost. Thorne knelt beside her chair, his eyes wide with wonder as he examined the changes in both of them. "You live," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The curse is broken, but you live." "We both live," she corrected, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that now carried visible traces of silver light. "And we are both changed. You are no longer truly vampire, but you are not simply human either. And I, she looked down at her hands with wonder. I think I understand now why my father never spoke of the old bloodlines. This power was meant to sleep until it was needed. The church officials rose from their knees, looking between the couple with expressions of bewildered awe. Whatever they had expected from this trial by ordeal, it had not been the transformation of two souls into something that transcended their previous categories of understanding. The marriage stands, Father Benedict declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed divine intervention. No earthly power can separate what has been joined by magic this ancient and pure. As the echo of his words faded in the chamber, both Thorne and Elsbeth understood that everything had changed between them yet again. But this time, the transformation had made them not just partners in an arrangement of convenience, but something far deeper and more profound. 6 months had passed since the transformation in the ritual chamber, and Ravenshollow Castle bore little resemblance to the isolated fortress it had once been. The ancient stones seemed to glow with an inner warmth that had nothing to do with torchlight, and the corridors that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of daily life, voices, calling greetings, children's laughter from the courtyard where Elsbeth held her healing lessons, and the comfortable bustle of a household that served a greater purpose than mere survival. The most striking change was in the great hall, where morning sunlight now streamed through windows that had been shuttered for centuries. Thorne stood in those golden rays without discomfort, his transformed nature allowing him to experience the warmth of daylight that had been denied to him since his mortal death. He was different now, still pale, still carrying the enhanced strength and senses that had marked his vampire nature, but free from the hunger that had driven him for so long. The phoenix fire had burned away the monstrous aspects of his curse while leaving him with abilities that served protection rather than predation. "The new apprentices are arriving this afternoon," Elsbeth said, wheeling her chair to join him by the great windows. Her own transformation was subtler but no less profound. The silver light that had entered her veins during the ritual could be seen sometimes in her eyes or fingertips, especially when she worked her healing magic. Her wheelchair remained a necessity, but it no longer felt like a limitation. Instead, it had become simply another tool in her expanded practice, no different from her mortar and pestle or the herb pouches that hung at her sides. "Apprentices, from how many villages now?" Thorne asked, moving to stand behind her chair with the easy familiarity of partners who had learned to work in harmony. 7, she replied with satisfaction. "Young women mostly, though a few men as well. Word has spread that there is a place here where the old healing arts are taught alongside the new, where magical ability is nurtured rather than feared." The transformation of Ravenshollow into a centre of learning had been Elsbeth's idea, but it had required both of their abilities to make it reality. Her awakened, magical heritage allowed her to teach not just herb lore and traditional medicine, but the deeper arts of healing that worked with supernatural as well as natural ailments. Thorne's enhanced abilities and centuries of accumulated knowledge made him an invaluable protector and instructor in his own right. They had established a formal arrangement with the church as well. Father Benedict had become a regular visitor to the castle, serving as liaison between their unconventional household and the religious authorities who had once sought to separate them. The trial by ordeal had convinced even the most skeptical church officials that divine will was at work here, and official recognition of their unique ministry had followed. "Master Gareth is beside himself with joy at having young people to fuss over again," Thorne observed, watching through the window as his long-time steward directed the preparation of additional chambers. The elderly man had taken to the expanded household with enthusiasm that had shaved years from his apparent age. "He has earned his happiness," Elsbeth replied warmly. 40 years of caring for one brooding vampire lord has prepared him well for managing a school of aspiring healers. The afternoon brought not just the new apprentices, but also visitors from the village, patients seeking treatment, parents bringing children for Elsbeth's evaluation, and village elders consulting on matters that affected the entire community. What had once been a castle avoided by all but the most desperate had become a place where people felt welcomed and valued. Among the visitors was Willem, the young blacksmith's apprentice, whose broken leg had been the first major test of Elsbeth and Thorne's partnership. He walked with barely a trace of limp now, his recovery so complete that he had become something of a testament to Elsbeth's skill. He had also become one of her most devoted supporters in the village, spreading word of the good work being done at the castle. "Lady Elsbeth," he said, approaching her chair with the respectful affection of someone whose life had been saved. "My master sent these for the new workshop." He indicated a collection of metal implements, tools specifically designed for someone working from a wheelchair, crafted with the attention to detail that marked master craftsmanship. "How thoughtful!" Elsbeth exclaimed, examining the tools with obvious pleasure. "Please give him my thanks, and tell him that his daughter is welcome to begin her apprenticeship whenever she feels ready." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of the afternoon's most significant visitor, a courier bearing the golden wedding, rings that had been commissioned from the finest craftsmen in the kingdom. Thorne accepted the wooden box with hands that trembled slightly, knowing that these rings would formalize what the ritual chamber had made mystically real. The rings themselves were works of art that seemed to capture the essence of their transformation. Forged from gold that had been somehow infused with traces of silver light, the same ethereal glow that marked Elsbeth's magical abilities, they seemed to pulse with gentle warmth when worn. The bands were inscribed with symbols that merged Christian iconography with the older magical traditions that had shaped their union, creating something entirely unique. "They are beautiful," Elsbeth breathed as Thorne slipped her ring onto her finger. The metal felt warm against her skin, and she could sense the magical resonance that would forever link her to the man she had chosen to love. "Not as beautiful as the woman who will wear one," Thorne replied, offering his own hand so that she could complete the exchange. "Though I think perhaps beauty is not the right word for what we have become." "What word would you use?" she asked, sliding his ring into place with ceremony that felt more sacred than any formal wedding could have been. "Complete," he said after a moment of thoughtful consideration. "For the first time in centuries, I feel complete." As evening approached, and the last of the day's visitors departed, they found themselves alone in the herb garden where so much of their relationship had been built. The plants thrived under Elsbeth's enhanced abilities, growing larger and more potent than natural cultivation could achieve. Moonlight filtered through the leaves of healing herbs and medicinal flowers, casting silver patterns on the stone paths. "Do you ever regret it?" Thorne asked, as they sat together in the gentle evening air. "The transformation, the responsibility, the life we have built here?" Elsbeth considered the question seriously, as she did all things. Around them, the castle hummed with quiet activity, apprentices studying by candlelight, Gareth banking the fires for the night, and the comfortable sounds of a household at peace. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "I came here seeking a home where I might be useful despite my limitations. I found instead a partnership where my limitations became irrelevant and my abilities became more than I had ever dreamed possible." She reached across the space between them to take his hand, their rings chiming softly as they touched. "You freed me as much as I freed you, Thorne. We saved each other." As they sat together in the moonlight, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built and the good they had accomplished, both understood that their story was not ending, but beginning. They had moved beyond the simple arrangement of convenience that had brought them together, beyond even the passionate love that had driven them to transformation, into something rarer and more precious, a partnership of souls that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. The golden rings on their fingers caught moonlight and seemed to glow with promises of years yet to come, of apprentices to train and patience to heal, of a love that had proven strong enough to transform curses into blessings and isolation into abundance. In the herb garden of Raven's Hollow Castle, two broken souls had indeed discovered that love was not about perfect bodies or perfect circumstances, but about perfect understanding between imperfect hearts.